Hi guys, how are you? And so we're going to go for it tonight. I think I told you last week I was having a little oral procedure done today, and I got stitches on both sides of my mouth right now. So I hope I articulate okay. Um, so if I don't, just let me know. Um, so okay, so tonight. Um, pretty much thoroughly covered over the first two classes the reliability of the New Testament. And I hope it built into you some confidence and some faith in that. And as I look at myself, I realize you're probably wondering why I'm sitting for this. Um, I'm just supposed to be taking it easy as possible, not standing or walking or anything. So forgive the casual appearance. But so we finished New Testament reliability, and I hope that answered all or many of your questions about why that book, over all the other books on the planet, why that book should have your trust more than any of them. Tonight, what we're going to do is pretty much answer a question that was asked to me in 2011. I was coaching baseball at Cardinal Gibbons High School, and the head coach asked me in the middle of a game, so it must have been really bothering him. He said, "Why doesn't God just open up the sky and stick his face through it and show us all that he's real? Why doesn't he just do that?" And I said, "You are paying attention to the game, aren't you?" And but I waited till after the game and I talked to him a little bit. But in the past 9 years, I've kicked that question around more and more. And what I want to do is give you my answer to that tonight. And I'm going to quote C.S. Lewis, and I believe I put his quote in your notes there. So, in answering the question of why doesn't God give us a definitive picture of himself, an overwhelming picture of his reality, we're going to talk about that. But if you would join me in a word of prayer, I'd like to offer this up to God. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for tonight. And we thank you for the opportunity to discuss things that actually bless our hearts when we realize the truth of it. That you are not hiding yourself, Lord. That you have revealed yourself to us. And we can confidently live day in and day out knowing we have a Father in heaven who loves us. So we offer this night to you in service to you and ask you to bless it for your will to be done in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So why doesn't God simply reveal himself face to face with us? He did it with Paul, didn't he? He overwhelmed the Apostle Paul with a definitive revelation of himself. He appeared as a bright light. He blinded Paul and said, "I'm Jesus whom you're persecuting." It doesn't get much clearer than that. But he doesn't do that for the rest of us, does he? So in the book, The Screwtape Letters, which is a book I highly recommend. If you've never read The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, I'd encourage you to make that your next book. It's a very entertaining book, and it's C.S. Lewis's very creative way of showing us how Satan works in our life. And he does it in a reverse way that you'll see through this quote. So I need to tell you before we read the quote that The Screwtape Letters is written from Satan's perspective. And Satan is raising up his nephew Wormwood to be the next devil in charge of the world type of thing. And as Wormwood goes through trying to damn people to hell, he always writes letters to his uncle Screwtape on problems that he's having getting these people to walk away from God. And then, of course, Screwtape will answer him and how to do it. And that's C.S. Lewis's way of letting you know how the devil kind of works in our lives. So, with that, C.S. Lewis said, "You must have wondered why the enemy," and I put God in quotes because you got to remember this is Satan speaking, so to him the enemy is God. "So you may have wondered why the enemy does not make more use of his power to be sensibly present to human souls in any degree he chooses and at any moment. But you now see that the irresistible and the indisputable are the two weapons which the very nature of his scheme forbids him to use, merely to override the human will, as his felt presence in any but the faintest and most mitigated degree would certainly do, would be for him useless. He cannot ravish, he can only woo. So in other words, for God to overwhelm our free will is counterproductive to him creating us in his image as free will beings. If we are truly the imago Dei, the image of God, and he has freedom in his will, we wouldn't be much of an image of his if we didn't have freedom in ours. So in that freedom, he chooses not to ravish our wills and say, you have no choice but to believe. Because what I did say to the Cardinal Gibbons coach back then was, if God pulled back the sky in the 1930s or 40s and showed his face to Adolf Hitler, I believe Adolf Hitler would have bowed his knee to him, but out of what condition of heart? Out of pure fear. You're bigger and stronger than me, so I got to bow a knee to you. But is that how God reveals himself? God reveals himself us in a way that wins our hearts over. How would a man look if he won a girl over by overwhelming her with power or his presence or something like that? It wouldn't be a love relationship, would it? But if he woos her, there's a chance for love there. So if God is a God of love, he'll be a God of wooing us, not ravishing our free wills. All right. So if God has chosen to not override our free will, maybe he's chosen a more authentic way. God has chosen to inspire certain men over the centuries to write down the revelation of himself, of what they saw and heard from him. These are our prophets and our evangelists. And he chose the written language, didn't he? He chose to do it through books, because written language is a precise medium of communication that can be easily duplicated and passed on to succeeding generations. Yet it can also be easily ignored by those who freely decide they don't want to be bothered by God. So the written word becomes the perfect heart test, doesn't it? If you want it, you'll read and you'll pursue. If you don't want it, you'll close the book and you'll walk away. So the written communication becomes God's chosen medium for revealing himself to us. But how do we know whose written communication is revealing the truth to us? Is it the Quran? Is it just the Old Testament and not the New? Is it both the New and the Old? Is it the Mahabharata? How do we know what book we should be looking for this truth? Did God use the book of the Jews or the Christians or the Muslims in revealing himself? Well, just as we know from ancient history, ancient kings would write letters that would go out to all the world. But how is one to know if it was actually the king who wrote it? The king would use a unique, one-of-a-kind seal that was unmistakable to his recipients, oftentimes on his ring. And he would impress this symbol on his ring into wax, and then impress that wax onto the letter. And when people saw that one-of-a-kind symbol, they knew that that was from the king. So does God have a seal that he used to authenticate his message? And I'm going to say he did. And that's going to be the title of the first part of our teaching tonight. What is God's seal to say, this is the book you should be reading and so forth? Now, I could very easily answer prophecy. That could be a whole nother topic we talk about, and maybe I just gave myself next week's lesson, actually. But this week, it's going to be miracles. Miracles set Christianity apart from all the other world religions, except for Judaism, because they have miracles, but that, of course, is talking about the same God. So then we would say, well, how do we know Judaism isn't the true religion? And I would suggest to you that in AD 70, when God destroyed the temple through the Romans, that was his judgment on Judaism. As Jesus predicted, their house would be left to them desolate within the generation of the apostles, that their generation wouldn't pass away till it happened, and sure enough, it happened in their generation. So miracles, particularly New Testament miracles, authenticate the Bible as the true book. Nicodemus from John chapter 3, the member of the Sanhedrin, the member of the Pharisees that came to Jesus at night, that Jesus gives his most famous verse to, for God so loved the world, Nicodemus confirms that the nature of miracles authenticate the messenger. The nature of miracles authenticate the messenger. So, Nicodemus says to Jesus, he doesn't just say I, he says, we know that you are a man sent from God because of all the miracles you've been doing. Okay? So he says, the fact that you're a miracle worker tells us you're from God. So Nicodemus's and first century Judaism's understanding of a miracle worker was, this is a messenger of God. You saw it with Moses, you saw it with Elijah, you saw it with Elisha. Now, surprise, surprise, we have skeptics about this idea. We have critics of this idea of miracles. And I'm going to introduce you to the two biggest names that have spoken out in history against miracles. The first one is Benedict Spinoza. I believe I've included him in your notes. Benedict Spinoza is from the 1670s, and he proposed the following objection to the possibility of miracles. He proposed the following objection to the possibility of miracles. He said that miracles are violations of natural laws. Now, at this point, we can agree with him. That's exactly what a miracle is. It's a violation of natural law. Gravity is a natural law. And if I started floating around the room for you, you wouldn't say, oh, that's very good. I'm glad he can do that. You'd say, that's a miracle. That's nothing natural. That is clearly supernatural. And so to not freak you out, I'm just going to stay in this chair tonight, the rest of the night. Now, miracles are a violation of natural laws. His second point is natural laws are immutable. That means unchangeable. So therefore, natural laws will always be the explanation for everything, according to Benedict Spinoza. His third point is it's impossible to violate immutable laws, so therefore miracles are impossible. So here's his argument again. I believe I've included this in the notes, haven't I? Is this in your notes, folks? Okay, good, excellent. All right, so he says miracles are violations of natural laws are immutable, and it's impossible to violate a natural law. So therefore, everything's explained by natural laws, and there are no miracles. Miracles must therefore be impossible. But is that true? Let's take a look and see if this makes any sense. Spinoza's argument has fallen out of contention ever since the Enlightenment, basically because of the third premise cannot be proven. We agree that miracles are violations of natural laws. We agree that they're immutable as far as the natural world is concerned. But is it impossible to violate immutable laws? And here's where we have the problem with Spinoza. We would say this. We would say whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist, both sides agree that the creation of the universe is a miracle. We believe that God spoke and everything came into existence. It's a miracle. They believe absolutely nothing existed and absolutely nothing happened to it, and everything came into existence through that. That is a miracle. Physics, the laws of physics, do not explain the beginning of the universe. And thanks to Einstein and folks like that, we know that the universe had a beginning. All cosmologists agree with that. In fact, I will be talking about the beginning of the universe during some of these classes. So, it's not impossible to violate immutable laws. The very creation of the universe violated natural law. And I would say this, whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, at one time there were no humans, and now there's humans. At one time there was no life, and now there's life. So how did life begin? Whether you're an evolutionist and you believe that the Big Bang just created the right chemical combinations, what those chemical combinations do not explain is how the chemicals went from non-living to living. That's a huge gap to bridge, going from non-life to life. We've never seen it happen. We never expect it to happen. Nobody looks at a rock and expects it to come to life one day. I personally call it the Frosty the Snowman theory. I say they don't have a magic hat. Without that magic hat, there's no explanation for the non-living becoming the living. So life and the universe are examples that natural laws are not impossible to violate. They have been violated. So Benedict Spinoza's proposal has fallen out of contention lately, but it was replaced with David Hume's argument. David Hume's argument can be summarized this way. he'll say that natural law is by definition a description of a regular occurrence. Of course it is. Natural law is by definition a description of a regular occurrence. A miracle by definition is a rare occurrence. Again, we're in agreement. The evidence for the regular occurrence is always greater than that for the rare occurrence. Of course it is. How can you call it a rare occurrence if it happens as much as a regular occurrence? Of course. Fourth point, a wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. Therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. Now, I find this to be utterly silly, quite frankly. So what is the numerous problems with David Hume's argument? I'm going to say the argument one more time, make sure you got a grasp of it. Natural law is a regular occurrence. A miracle is a rare occurrence. The evidence of the regular is greater than the evidence for the rare. Wise people base their beliefs on greater evidence. Therefore, a wise person should never believe in miracles. So what he basically does is he defines a miracle as a rare event, and then he punishes the miracle for being a rare event. Now, premise 3 is where Hume's argument has the major problem, that the evidence of the regular is always greater than that for the rare. One counterexample will disprove his theory, but I'll give more than one counterexample. Again, the origin of the universe happened how many times? Once. That's a rare event. But did it happen? I think we all agree that the universe indeed came into existence. How about the origin of life again? How many times did life begin? Once. Rare event, yet we know that it happened. How about this one? Evolution. If David Hume believes in evolution, how many times did evolution, the origin of new life, happen in the evolutionary theory? Once. Rare event. And my favorite one is this. How about David Hume's birth? How many times was he born? Once. Rare event. Wise people should not believe in the birth of David Hume then, based on his own definitions. So David Hume is a very, very smart man. So is Benedict Spinoza. But I want you to see that these very smart people have very shaky arguments when they go against the creationist argument or the argument for miracles. These are their published responses to miracles. So if David Hume held consistently to his argument against miracles, he could neither believe in macroevolution or the beginning of the universe, nor could he believe that he was ever even born, based on his own definitions. Additional problems with David Hume is this. He confuses believability with possibility. So he would say if it's not likely, then you shouldn't believe it at all. He would have to say that he would have to say to an eyewitness to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, would have to disregard what his own senses were telling him and deny what he sees, hears, and feels, like doubting Thomas, as I want to touch, in order to be a wise person. So doubting Thomas would be called unwise for believing Jesus after he touches the wounds, because he thinks that if it's not likely, it shouldn't be a believable event. Now, probably one of the most powerful verses in all of Scripture that seal this argument is, well, before I tell you the verses, first of all, if you speak to many scientists, their pride lies in them saying, I need to see it. I need to be able to observe it. That's the scientific method. Otherwise, I don't believe it. Well, in 1 John chapter 1, the first 4 verses sound something like this. The Apostle John says, that which was from the beginning, that which we have seen with our eyes, we have handled with our hands, we have heard with our ears. There's 3 senses, hearing, sight, and touch. That is what we're proclaiming to you concerning the word of life, that life was manifested. Manifested means made available to our senses. He's saying this eternal life was manifested, made available to our eyes, our ears, our touch. And that's what we're proclaiming to you, is what we've seen and what we've heard and what we've touched. So these men, to be credible, would have to overcome John's testimony. They'd have to say John thought he saw God, touched God, and heard from God. But here's why he didn't. And I don't think you can come up with a credible argument with that, because John sacrificed all of his own comfort and well-being for the rest of his life to be able to say, my friend rose from the dead. That is a hard thing to overcome, and it's never been overcome. All right. David Hume also confuses probability with evidence. He doesn't weigh the evidence for rare events. He says if it's rare, it shouldn't be believed, even if that rare event has evidence. So rather, he gives weight to the probability of regular events while discounting the countless testimonies of rare events. How many of you have ever heard somebody say they hit a hole-in-one? David Hume would say you shouldn't believe them. And maybe you shouldn't, because people make that stuff up all the time. But I'm sure it's happened. In fact, I may have seen one or two on TV. But because it's a rare event, he would say you're not wise in believing it. You can see how very fragile his argument is. So Hume argues in a circle. Instead of weighing the evidence of a miracle, he rules it out from the beginning due to his preconceived beliefs against them. David Hume makes the same mistake that all Darwinists make. He hides his conclusions and the premise of his argument by way of a false philosophical presupposition. His false philosophical presupposition is that all human experiences are without miracles. He can't know that, so he presupposes it. But as we have consistently seen, miracles are possible, and the reason is because God exists. So although Hume correctly identifies miracles as rare events, he then punishes them for being so. It's as if he's saying, if only miracles were regular events, then I could believe in them. But if they were regular events, they'd be explained by natural laws or as an unexplained natural phenomenon. It's the very rarity of a miracle that's part of what distinguishes it as an act of God. Hume should not mute out that feature. So according to David Hume, even if there's a God who performs miracles, we shouldn't believe in the miracles he performs because they're not regularly occurring events. There's something wrong with an argument that tells you to disbelieve what you've seen actually occur and require that miracles not be miracles in order to be believable. So Benedict Spinoza, David Hume, very wise in their own areas of science, but trying to explain away miracles, I hope you agree, they don't do very, very good job. So the bottom line is that Hume, without any justification, simply declares that the only believable events are regularly occurring events, and since a miracle is not a regular occurring event, it fails to meet his artificial criteria. As we mentioned above, if we can't believe in rare events, then we can't believe in anything from history, because history is comprised of succeeding, rare, unrepeatable events. So clearly his position is unreasonable. So this question gets asked a lot as well. Why don't we see biblical miracles today? Why don't we see them today? Well, on a biblical scale, we don't. And I think we have a very good reason why, but we certainly see them on individual levels. We have a CCA graduate whose older sister was in a terrible, terrible jet ski accident several months ago and broke many parts of her back, her ribs, many head injuries. She was knocked unconscious, and she was floating face down in the water and couldn't move, face down in the water, just minutes from drowning to death with all of her injuries and her inability to move. And there was a man about to launch his boat to go fishing who saw her and went into the water, and all he could do, all he had the strength to do was just to keep her head above the water so she could breathe, and yelled for help, and people came and they got her to a hospital. In the first 24 hours, the prayers were for her to live because it was very uncertain she'd live or not. But not only has she lived, but she's had remarkable healing, very fast healing, that her doctors have said the only explanation for this girl is miracle. There's nothing medical going on here. There's nothing, according to medical books, happening here. She is being attended to by a miracle. And very, very strong Christian family, wonderful Christian family, who started a prayer network for her, and we believe that God intervened for her, because that's more believable based on the evidence than the medical procedures that the doctors who administered the medical procedures say it ain't the medical procedures. This is beyond what we expected. She's out and about and walking around, little pain in her neck, scar on her cheek, but otherwise she's doing great. So, yeah. But what about the big, large-scale miracles? Well, Hebrews chapter 1 tells us that Jesus is the last and the greatest revelation of God. Hebrews 1 tells us that Jesus Christ is the last and the greatest revelation of God. So it says, in the past, God spoke to our forefathers at many times and in various ways. And the various ways are various miraculous ways. It says, but in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. So for God to continue to perform miracles, which the purpose of the miracles is to authenticate the messenger. The miracle worker is authenticated through the miracles, okay? So if Jesus Christ is the greatest revelation that we're to put all of our attention to, then you could see why there shouldn't be any more biblical scale miracles today. It would say that Jesus wasn't the focal point of the revelations. So where did we see biblical miracles in the Bible? Well, it might surprise you. We only saw them through 3 different eras. And these 3 eras of time were significant in that God was doing something unique with mankind, that miracles confirmed that it was God that was doing it. And all 3 eras were eras of great deliverances. Moses was a great miracle worker, and he was delivering Israel from bondage to the Egyptians. So he's freeing them from their bondage to the Egyptians, and miracles, he was empowered to do miracles to do that. And the second era was the Elijah and Elisha era, where God was freeing his people from the bondage of idolatry and all that the false kings brought into their land. And the third era of biblical miracles, of course, is Jesus and the apostles, because remember, the apostles in the book of Acts were great miracles themselves. And of course, they're being delivered from the bondage of sin and death. Obviously, the greatest and biggest and most important deliverance of them all. So, 3 eras of biblical miracles: Moses era, Elijah and Elisha era, and Jesus and the apostles era. And they're all dealing with great deliverances of God's people in one way or another. All right. Now that we've talked about miracles, the question is, when I asked earlier, did God use miracles to establish Islam, Judaism, or Christianity? The answer then becomes Islam. When Muhammad was asked, Muhammad was literally asked, Jesus had many miracles. What are your miracles? His answer was, the Quran is my miracle. And I have read the Quran and I've read the Bible, and I could tell you one truly insists upon its very nature that it's miraculous, and there's no other explanation for it. The other one doesn't have any indication of it, except for they'll say Muhammad was a bit illiterate and things like that, yet he wrote the Quran. I don't deny that he was under supernatural guidance. My question is, was it from above or below? So, but he didn't perform any miracles. He performed some horrible, horrible acts, but it's certainly nothing miraculous. So, what I want to do for our last thing together tonight, before we do Q&A, is I want to talk about the greatest miracle ever in the world. And I think you all just said the same phrase. It's the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. As the Apostle Paul clearly says, if all the miracles have been done, if that one didn't happen, then we, the people who call ourselves Christians, are the most to be pitied if that resurrection never happened, because we put all of our eggs in that one basket. If he rose from the dead, then everything else makes sense. If he didn't rise from the dead, then we are victims of the greatest hoax ever perpetuated upon mankind. There is no in between with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So therefore, I am going to bring you to the most respected, famous, and researched person on the resurrection. His name is Gary Habermas. Maybe you've heard of him. Gary Habermas completed the most comprehensive study ever done on the resurrection, ever. He studied over 1,400 of the most critical scholarly works written between 1975 and 2003. Can you imagine that? 1,400 scholarly works between 75 and 03. He reports that across the wide spectrum, from ultra-liberal scholars to the most conservative of scholars, that they all agree with 12 facts regarding the resurrection. So it doesn't matter where their bias leads. Here's 12 things Gary Habermas says everybody agrees upon if you talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I believe I copied these onto your notes. First thing everybody agrees upon is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Okay, so that's counted as established history. Jesus died of Roman crucifixion. All these points are considered established history now. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. He was buried, most likely in a private tomb. Soon afterwards, the disciples were discouraged, bereaved, and despondent, having lost hope. The fourth one is Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his burial. So now, if you like all the CSI shows and all that, your mind's starting to click in. Okay, where's the body? This is all agreed upon stuff here. The fifth agreed upon point is the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Christ. So they all agree, all these scholars agree, that the apostles lived out the rest of their decades as if they really believed they actually saw Jesus risen from the dead. Okay, none of it looked like they were living a hoax or anything like that. The sixth one is, due to these experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. They were even willing to die for their belief. I went over 10 things that radically changed in first century Judaism based on the belief of the resurrection. Their day of worship went from Saturday to Sunday. They stopped sacrificing animals. Now think if you were a first century Jewish person and your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents all the way back to Moses. Speaking of Moses, there's Darren with his beard. Hey, Darren. All right. All the way back to Moses. You're sacrificing animals. You're worshiping on Saturday. And then as soon as you see Jesus risen from the dead, you don't see any of that anymore. It's all gone. And they would have had a tremendous fear at that moment that they can't go to heaven. We're supposed to be doing these things for our own righteousness. Suddenly they believed that Jesus fulfilled all that for them. So the seventh one is the proclamation of the resurrection took place very early from the very beginning of church history. So people that want to say it was a myth or a legend that developed over the decades that Jesus rose from the dead. Now we have an early creed found in 1 Corinthians 15 that dates to the 30s AD, the same decade that Jesus died and rose again. If you look at the first few verses from 1 Corinthians 15, Paul will say this. He'll say, I pass on to you that which I received, that Christ died according to the Scriptures, rose on the third day according to the Scriptures, and then appeared, and he'll say to Cephas, to James, to the 12, then to 500 people at once. He says, many are still alive today. And then he says, and then he appeared lastly to me. Now that creed, as far as he died according to the Scriptures, rose on the third day according to the Scriptures, dates all the way back to the same decade that Jesus died and rose again in the 30s. So we have very, very, very early testimony to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The eighth point is the disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. In other words, if you're going to say a guy died and rose again, and he didn't, and you know that he didn't, you're not going to do it in the same city where he died and say that he appeared in that same city. You're asking to be being disproved, aren't you? Okay, so the very city, it'd make more sense if he went to another country and started saying it. That's a much easier sell than it is to stay right in the same area where he was crucified and say he's risen again. All right, and remember, why did Pilate guard that tomb? Why did he guard it with Roman soldiers? Because they knew Jesus predicted his resurrection on the third day. So they knew that he spoke it, so they guarded the tomb. And the easiest job soldiers were ever given, watch this dead guy that he doesn't go anywhere, and they failed. The dead guy went somewhere. It's really remarkable. Okay? All right. The ninth point is the gospel message centered on the preaching of the death and resurrection of Jesus. So this whole gospel message that went on never tried to disguise the fact that we're talking about Jesus risen from the dead. It was always the first and foremost point the apostles made in their preaching, wherever they went in the world, that he is risen from the dead. The 10th point is that Sunday was the primary day for gathering and worship. That requires a lot of explanation when they were nothing but Saturday worshipers before that. The 11th point, James, the brother of Jesus and a skeptic before this time, was converted when he believed. He also saw the risen Jesus. So this is the very brother of Jesus that gave him a hard time during his 3-year ministry. We see him challenging Jesus to make himself known openly because he was skeptical about him. Well, James becomes the first ever leader of the Jerusalem church, supporting his brother because he saw him risen from the dead. Okay, so James, just like Paul, and this is our 12th point, where just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul, became a Christian believer, due to an experience that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Christ. So when you say, Paul, I thought you wanted these guys arrested and killed. You even took part in their arrests and their executions. How come all of a sudden you're preaching the very thing you tried to stop? The only explanation he ever gave was, because I saw him and I spoke with him. And I understand his great love for us now. Remember, that happened in one afternoon. He never went to seminary or anything like that to change. The apostles never spoke to him about changing. He went on a walk to Damascus to get letters of approval to arrest more Christians. And by the time he got there, he was probably the greatest, most productive apostle our church has ever seen. Explain that, apart from the fact that he saw the risen Christ. Good luck with that if you try it. Okay, so guess what? There's skeptics to all this. Can you believe it? There's people that doubt it. So let's talk about I think there's the four most popular theories to explain the empty tomb. And I want you to remember, none of these theories and none of these anti-Christian experts will say that Jesus' body was in the tomb. Now, one of them will dare go there and say the body was still there. Actually, one of them does. I take that back, and you'll hear his argument in a second. Okay? So let's go through the explanations of why the tomb was empty or why the apostles believed that he rose again. The first one's called the hallucination theory. The hallucination theory says that the apostles and the other eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus all experienced hallucinations. There's two major flaws that cancel out this theory. Flaw number one, hallucinations are not experienced by groups, only by individuals, like dreams. Can you imagine if you showed up for church one Sunday morning and you said to 500 people in the lobby, I had a dream, and you give great details of your dream, and 499 others speak up and said, I had the same dream. There'd be no way. Well, this is the same thing. Hallucinations, as you can ask any psychologist, are not group experiences. They are individual experiences. Jesus appeared on a dozen different occasions in a variety of settings to different people over a 40-day period. That is not a hallucination. These are different people, different places, on different occasions. Another problem with the hallucination theory is the fact that the tomb, it's agreed that the tomb was empty. So if they're all hallucinating seeing the risen Christ, how do you explain the fact that his body's not in the tomb? And as soon as people start saying he's risen, and you want to say, well, you're just hallucinating, don't you go to the tomb and check out the body yourself? Listen, if anybody ever saw the corpse of Jesus Christ, that body would have been paraded down Main Street of Jerusalem right away, because all the most powerful people in that city wanted him dead. And they didn't want any rumors of resurrection. They would have paraded his corpse for all to see. And of course, that parade never occurred. All right, the second theory is called the wrong tomb theory. And this is the only one that would argue that Jesus' body was still in the tomb. But here's how crazy this one is. Some skeptics argue that perhaps the disciples went to the wrong tomb. They're supposed to make a right at the oak tree. They made a left at the oak tree, and they looked into the wrong tomb, and the wrong tomb was empty, and they thought it was Jesus' tomb. Well, keep in mind, as they go to the wrong tomb, they'd have to wonder, why is that other tomb guarded by the Roman soldiers? That's weird. All right? They knew exactly where Jesus was buried. This would leave the Jewish and Roman authorities, who clearly knew which tomb was the right tomb, with the opportunity to go to the right tomb and present the corpse. So as soon as people start saying, well, the apostles went to the wrong tomb, then leadership would have certainly proved that theory by producing his body. And of course, we know that never happened. A second flaw to this theory is it still does not explain the 12 resurrection appearances. So meanwhile, Jesus is lying in peace in the right tomb. Everybody passes it and goes to the wrong tomb. And then they all have claims that they saw the risen Christ. So now you got everybody going to the wrong tomb and mass hallucinations happening at the same time. All right, the third theory is called the swoon theory. And this theory claims that Jesus never actually died on the cross. He simply passed out from blood loss. And then he revived in the coolness of his tomb. When he revived in the coolness of the tomb, keep in mind, he has a 2,000-pound stone he's got to roll away. He's got a Roman guard to overcome. And then he's got to appear to his apostles as the one who just received victory over death. And he would have needed serious medical attention. He was flogged 39 times. He was beaten over the head with rods. And he was nailed to a cross, stabbed in the heart to where they saw water and blood coming out of his heart. And then he would have had to come out of that swoon on the third day, because he said it'd be on the third day, so it would have to be this major coincidence that he became conscious the very day he predicted. And then again, in that medical condition, move a 2-ton stone, overcome the Roman guard, and appear to his apostles as somebody who doesn't need a doctor, but I just took down the kingdom of death for you. The brutality of the crucifixion was designed to ensure death. And we just don't know of anybody ever surviving crucifixion. The purpose for breaking the legs and stabbing Jesus in the heart was to verify death before they ever removed a corpse from a cross. So they're trained in this killing, and they ensure the killing. And Jesus was in that tomb for 3 days with no medical attention. So if you want to go with that, I just got to say, you just don't have the evidence in your favor whatsoever. So the Journal of the American Medical Association, dated March 21st, 1986, they wrote this: March 21st, 1986, when asked to give a medical report on the crucifixion and the injuries of Jesus Christ, they wrote this. They said, clearly, the weight of the historical and the medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. So before he even gets the spirit of the heart, the medical evidence confirms that he was dead. Why? And it supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right rib probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, Interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So 1986 is about 1,950 or so years after the crucifixion, and that 1,950 years of medical advancement also confirms he must have certainly have been dead on that cross. Also keep in mind, he would have been mummified in 75 pounds of bandages and spices that they used to embalm people. How would he get himself unwrapped from that? He would have had to have survived 36 hours while massively bleeding. He would have had to unwrap himself, move a 2-ton stone, overcome the Roman guards, and then present himself to the apostles as the defeater of death when he would have needed serious medical attention. Plus, it would not explain why Saul of Tarsus became the Apostle Paul. If all that swoon theory happened, what's Paul's explanation for becoming a Christian? He only said, I saw the risen Christ. He's not talking about, he said a bright light with Jesus' voice appeared. That's not what a badly beaten man would appear to you as. Now, Josephus that we talked about already, Tacitus, Thallus, the Jewish Talmud are all non-Christian sources that affirm Jesus' death on the cross. So it's not just our Bible, it's not just the apostles, it's not just Christianity. It's also all walks of life affirm the death of Jesus Christ on that cross. All right, a fourth theory, and I believe this is our final one. And this was the very first theory that ever went out, and it's the only one of these theories that's actually recorded in the New Testament for us. And it's that the disciples stole the body. Now, this wasn't a theory that the New Testament brought up as a possibility. It's presented in the New Testament as the great cover-up when the Roman guards report to Pilate that Jesus is gone. Pilate knows that Jesus said, I'd rise again on the third day. So he told the guards, tell him you fell asleep, and while sleeping, the apostles stole the body. Now that would mean execution for these Roman soldiers, yet Pilate promised them cover on not getting in trouble if they would just uphold that story. Now, this accusation against the disciples transfers them from the ones being deceived. So if the swoon theory were true or the wrong tomb theory were true, that would make the apostles as people that were deceived. This theory makes them the deceivers, correct? They would be deceiving others if they stole the body. And it would have been very self-defeating for them to steal this body. Why? Well, how many of you would make up a lie and the next 20 to 30 years of your life would result in beatings and imprisonments and finally a death sentence that's carried out and you're executed for, and you knew the whole time you just made up the story and you never took it back? So, and if the original disciples stole the body, the question is, who appeared to Paul? Paul stands apart from all of this as an independent witness of seeing the resurrected Christ that had nothing to do with the death and burial of Jesus Christ, had nothing to do with the immediate appearances of Christ. It was a much later appearance of Christ. He's apart from the 12. He was even against the 12, yet he has the same testimony as well. So we'd have to ask who appeared to Paul then, and how did these apostles overcome the Roman guards? It's really hard to believe they tiptoed while they were sleeping, that they would really risk moving that stone with sleeping Roman guards there, knowing if they woke up they'd be immediately at least arrested, if not killed, right there. So there are no other published options that I've ever read. If you've read some, I appreciate you emailing me those. But the swoon theory, the hallucination theory, the apostle stealing the body theory, and the wrong tomb theory are the ones that are in the Apologetics books and so forth that I've read. And the fact that especially the prophet Isaiah gives us 800 years of advance notice on this event. If you read Isaiah 52:13 to the end, and then chapter 53 as well, it's unmistakable that he's given a vision of the crucifixion, and he's giving us details of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So, with all of that, that is the greatest miracle in Christianity, the one that all of our importance hinges upon. There's no sense in talking about healing the blind or anything like that if it's not established that he rose from the dead. Him rising from the dead shows that he is who he says he is, and which means he's with his Father right now, preparing a place for people like you and me. Isn't that wonderful? All right. So with that, my friends, we can open it up to some questions now if you'd like.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have a lot of questions rolling in tonight. We are going to start with a question. Early on in tonight's teaching, you made a comment that Jews worship the same God that we do. And the question is, do Jews really worship the same God as Christians? I've always struggled with this since Jews have not embraced Jesus Christ, so they do not necessarily believe in the Trinity. So how do we believe in the same God?
Well, we would all, both Jews and Christians would say they worship Yahweh. So they would literally say the same name that God revealed to Moses. So if you talk about the Father, then I'd say absolutely the same. They don't believe that the Father revealed Jesus Christ as the Son, though. And wouldn't ever be able to say that the Holy Spirit shared in power and glory with the Father and the Son. But when you talk about Yahweh and his revelation to Moses, we believe that God, they believe that God. So that's where I feel the freedom to say that. Certainly they wouldn't say he's triune. We would say he is. They wouldn't say Jesus and the Holy Spirit are God. We would certainly say they are. But when we talk about the Father, there's where the similarity is. In all of his interactions with Moses and Abraham and David and all of them, we would all agree on that.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. We have another question that says, would the fact that David Hume and David Spinoza were alive on this earth be considered a miracle?
Benedict Spinoza and David Hume. The fact that they were alive, yes, because any life, I don't care if it's plant life, algae, anything that's alive, has no explanation from going from non-living. I remember before the Big Bang, and you're probably wondering, does this guy believe in the Big Bang? Absolutely, I do. It's scientifically proven, and we will go over that in these 8 weeks. But the question is the Big Bang God-driven Genesis 1 event, or is it a natural phenomena that only the law of physics encounters? And when you ask that question, they have absolutely nothing to say. And this is the beautiful thing. In fact, I'll show you quote after quote of cosmologists that early in the 20th century, when the Big Bang was discovered and proven and all that, they're saying, if you believe in Genesis 1, this is like Christmas morning for you. Because this shows the universe had a beginning, and you only got to read into 3 words of your Bible to get to that word beginning. And in Hebrew, it's the very first word of the Bible. So, you know, I don't think God would say to Moses, hey, E equals MC squared, and give him all the physics involved with the Big Bang. I think he'd say, in the beginning, I created the heavens and the earth. On day 1, I did this. Day 2, I did this. But it's certainly, the Big Bang is certainly one of the greatest discoveries of creationism that we've had, and I'll show you guys that in the weeks to come. But I don't think that was the question, though. What was the actual question?
The actual question was, wouldn't the fact that they are alive on this earth be considered a miracle?
Yes, because now I know why I brought all that up. Because at some point there was no life anywhere, and then suddenly there was. And they simply look at the evolution and say, explain. And they go. I read one guy that said, give us the first miracle and then we'll explain everything else. To which I would answer, I'll give you the first miracle as soon as you can give me a miracle worker. It's the law of cause and effect. You can't have an effect without a cause. Miracles are effects. They need causes for them. So we have a cause for the first miracle. They certainly don't. And think about this. And I mean this. I don't mean it to be funny. And most of you will say, nothing you say is ever funny. But I try sometimes. But But if you get pulled, if you run your car into a tree and a police officer comes up to you and you say to that police officer, "Officer, I don't know what happened. It came out of nowhere." If he's an evolutionist, he's forced to say, "I hate when that happens," because he believed everything came out of nowhere. So why couldn't a tree come out of nowhere? He has to believe that, or he's a hypocrite as an evolutionist. But of course, he doesn't believe that because he understands reality too well. And that means if you understand reality well enough, you can't be an evolutionist. You just can't. So life would be evidence of something went from non-living to living. I knew I'd get to the answer sooner or later. Something would have to go. We were at 100% non-living things in our universe at one point, and now we have living things. Explain that. What came to life and how did it come to life?
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. We have another question here that says, how would we explain to a Seventh-day Adventist who claims that Saturday is the official day of worship?
Yeah, I would. I'd quote the Apostle Paul to them because they receive him as an apostle, and he says, and people try to play games with this language, but if you just leave the language and let it speak for itself, he says, "Do not let anybody judge you according to a new moon festival, a Sabbath, or any kind of feast day. No one's to judge you according to those things." You would never say that in Judaism. If you didn't keep the Sabbath, nobody would say, "Don't let anybody judge you for not keeping the Sabbath." But Paul says, it's been fulfilled on your behalf. I believe we're in an eternal Sabbath, that Jesus allowed us to enter into an eternal Sabbath. Why do I believe that? Because the Sabbath was resting from what? Work. What are we freed from for our righteousness? Freed from works-based righteousness. We've been set free from all that. So we've entered into this continuous Sabbath, is how I view it. And I do believe for your soul's health, there should be a day that you say no to things you don't normally say no to and use that energy and time to focus in on God. I think you'll be a better human being for it. But if you say others are wrong for not doing it, or if you say that you're more righteous because you do and others don't, that's where I think you fall into legalism and you're not accepting the freedom that Jesus purchased for you on the cross. That's what I'd say to the Seventh-day Adventists.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. Jorge, if you are ready to ask your question, Billy has a question on miracles. Jorge, if you can unmute yourself.
Sure, Pastor Bill, thanks for your class. Always great teaching. I have a question about the miracles. I took a class with Dr. Geiser a few years ago, and his definition of miracles in Apologetics had to do with the changes, supernatural changes with the most of physics, chemistry, biology, all things that could not be explained with science. But this is my question, and I still don't have an answer. I want to hear your biblical perspective about miracles. When Jesus forgives the paralytic person, Matthew 9, Luke 5, Mark 2, the person is forgiven for his sins, but he also retains his ability to walk. Now, the way I understand the miracle is that the person can walk, obviously. That's the miracle. We observe that. But the person is also saved. There is a change, there is a transformation. Would you say that the salvation of a person is considered a miracle? Because this is where I'm going with this. In 1 Corinthians 12, there is a number of gifts. One of them is the gift of healing. Some people may have that gifting. So obviously the question is, are miracles happening today? And if so, is the gifting of healing the only gifting that can generate miracles? How about the other ones? So I'm a bit confused if you can shed some light about what's the proper biblical position, non-denominational biblical position of miracles? Thank you.
Yeah. Is it possible for you to take like all of that and put it into like a one sentence question for me?
Is the salvation of a person considered a miracle? And can the gifting of healing be considered a miracle? If a person has the gifting of healing, and
Okay.
so miracles happen to them, that's it.
Okay. So salvation is, I think, clearly a miracle because there's nothing in nature that can get you saved. It's purely a work of God, and I think that's a strong definition for a miracle. It's something only God can do. So I would say salvations are miracles, yes, indeed. And as far as the gift of healing goes, there's two Christian camps on that. Some are called cessationists, which believes that those gifts have ceased and they don't exist today, and others believe that the gifts go on today. And I've certainly seen plenty of videos and heard plenty of claims of people that have the gifts of healing. And things that I've seen are entirely believable, even though I don't know how to verify in any way. So, and I bet you with however many people are watching right now, there's people in both camps on that. As far as a person having the gift of healing, not quite as sure, but what I would say is I certainly believe that God heals even today. As I mentioned, the girl on the jet ski. And being a part of the prayer team at Calvary, that when people request prayer, I'm one of the people that get the emails to pray for them. And so many times you hear reports of healings happening that go beyond the doctor's explanations, that don't fit the natural healing processes. They're much more advanced than the natural healing processes. So I would tend to believe, I certainly believe God does miraculous healings, but I don't know of anybody that would say, I don't know of anybody that could say, I have the gift of healing, so bring me your injury and I will heal you of that injury. And I tend I lack evidence for that. Maybe some of you have evidence for that. I've seen videos of a guy named Troy, who lives out in California now, of videos of him laying his hands on people, praying away their lifelong disabilities, and they're walking again. And is it legit or not? Couldn't tell you. So I don't put a lot of energy or attention into those events. So first answer, yes, I think salvation's a miracle, only God can do. Second answer, I think God still heals today. I don't know that he assigns people for that gift today to do that or not. He may very well. I mean, I can meet somebody tomorrow that has overwhelming proof of that. I don't know. And I'd be open to it being true or not true. In other words, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you for your honesty, Pastor Bill.
Yes.
We have another question for you. It says, earlier you mentioned that the Quran or Muhammad wrote supernaturally. How did you come to that conclusion?
Oh, I didn't conclude that at all. That was his claim. He said the Quran, when asked, where's all your miracles, like Jesus had, he said the Quran is my miracle. That was his claim. And if there's any evidence that, I mean, if you read the Quran, there's, when I did the 7 angels of Revelation with you guys, that's miraculous writing. The fisherman John could not put through 2 different books, John and Revelation, that picture of fulfilling Jesus' promise to Nathanael together like that. In fact, most scholars would say John didn't even know he did that he showed that through those 7 angels. He's just writing. But the Quran has nothing like that. It just reads, if you read the Bible and then you read like To Kill a Mockingbird, you understand that they're different writings. They're just not the same at all. The Quran reads more like To Kill a Mockingbird. It's just words on a page, it's just telling history. It's like a history book as well. And so for Muhammad to use that as his claim is very weak, because I could write a book and say, that's my miracle, that's my proof. and the rest of the world could read it and go, why is that your proof? And most scholars will tell you that Muhammad died of poisoning. He got poisoned by a woman that prepared a meal for him. And honest to God, what I say to that, what kind of prophet are you? You're eating a meal that you don't know has been poisoned to you, and you die from it. At least Jesus knew exactly when he would die and how he would die, and that he'd rise again. To me, that's a prophet. So I'm not claiming the Quran to be supernatural. I claim the opposite. It's very natural. If not demonic, maybe that's a supernatural aspect of it. It may very well be demonic, because I don't have trouble believing Muhammad's claim that an angel appeared to him. I question that it was an angel from heaven, though. Because Paul said, even if an angel from heaven, Galatians 1:8, even if an angel from heaven comes and gives you a gospel different from the gospel I'm giving you, tell him he's anathema, which means eternally damned. I think Muhammad's job when that angel appeared to him was to say, you're anathema. You're giving me a different gospel than the gospel of Christ. And that's how he failed. But I don't deny that that supernatural being, probably demonic, inspired his writing.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. We have another question here that says, do you believe in some of the claims for people that have had near-death experiences and seen heaven?
I used to believe it more, but it's another one I don't like getting near because it doesn't change anything biblically for me. And I think people have made fame and fortune off of false claims, and I don't know how to tell the difference, to be honest with you. Seems to me, Paul says, to be separate from the bodies, to be present with the Lord, and I've never heard of anybody getting sent back in the Bible, but the Bible doesn't capture every possibility either. God's free to work outside of, what he shows us in the Bible. So I read one book just to see if that one book appealed to me and appeared to be true. And they had doctors' testimonies of this kid should not be alive, and the kid was only 5 years old when he said he had visions of heaven. Somebody told me it got debunked, but I haven't read about it. But I was pretty impressed that a 5-year-old held consistently to a story, and that doctors were verifying, and the doctors were quoted in the book and all. But yeah, I just don't know. You guys are asking, you're making me look bad tonight. I don't know these answers.
Well, hopefully we can get you a question here that you can answer. And the question was from someone that just said simply, did Jesus really survive the crucifixion?
Did he really survive it?
Yes, that's the question.
If resurrection qualifies for surviving it, then yes. If you're getting at, did he not actually die and survive that way, then no. He clearly died. I was going to joke and say, if you want to do an experiment, but it's not a funny joke, but lash somebody 39 times the way they did, beat them up really good, and let him hang there on a cross all afternoon, and then stab him in the heart, and you tell me if he's dead or not. And if any of you do that, I'm going to deny I said it in a court of law. So no, I'm not advising you. I'm just saying think about that for a moment.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have one last question for you here. If I have read everything, it says, in speaking of salvation, we see many people walking away from the Lord. Recently, a member of a famous Christian band. I know we speak of once saved, always saved, but is this really the case? Do you believe that that person can now reject Jesus, but yet will still be in eternity with Jesus if he were to die today?
I wouldn't word things the way that was worded. I think once you're saved, you're always saved, even though I've really challenged myself in that belief through some verses like Hebrews chapter 10, Hebrews 4, might be Hebrews 6. I can't remember if it was 4 or 6. But very challenging passages, but I think I see them more easily in light of once saved, always saved. And I think you can explain all the verses that bring questions to that more clearly through once saved, always saved than that you could lose your salvation. So as far as these, I think there's been more than one worship leader that has denied the faith recently. And the Apostle John, in either 1st, 2nd, or 3rd John, I'm not sure which one, he brings up that dynamic and says, those who were with us, who went away from us, were not really of us. So those prepositions make it seem like the withedness of people that join the Christian community, that walk away, were never really of us. In other words, St. Augustine said it this way. He said there's two churches, the visible and the invisible. The visible church is what John's talking about, that, hey, they were with us. We could see them. You show up for church every Sunday and you see the congregation. But is that entire congregation going to heaven one day? Probably not. Because Jesus talks about in Matthew, many people that call him Lord will be told, depart from me, you worker of evil, I never knew you. And they're actually calling him Lord. So there's an inauthenticity in some people's walks that make it appear that they're a part of the group, but they're not, and they could therefore walk away. I think it's actually easier to do that if you're in a Christian band, because it could very well be your talent in music that got you in that Christian community, and there was really nothing authentic and real there. And over time of singing such lofty, holy words to Jesus for years, at some point you're just going to go, I don't believe that. What am I doing? Plus, secular bands make way more money. So really, what am I doing? So, yeah, I certainly lean towards once saved, always saved. I think all of the questionable passages on people losing their salvation have explanations with they were never really saved. But I don't believe the reverse is true, that that if you don't believe once saved, always saved, that you can explain how nobody can be plucked from Jesus' hand, and all who come to the Father are saved, and things like that. Those would be very hard to explain away if you could lose your salvation.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. To everyone, just a reminder that tonight's teaching, you can find it on YouTube. We will also post a link on
I kind of lost audio. I think you asked me about Monday night. Is that right?
Yeah. I posted the link to your Facebook page in the chat for everyone so they can pick up tonight's recording. We will post it. It's actually a YouTube link. You can find it over in YouTube. But as always, since we're out of questions, Bill, what are you going through in your Monday night study?
Well, we just finished John 17, the high priestly prayer of Jesus, and just kind of really dug into the prayer he had for himself, and the prayer he had for the apostles, and then he finishes with a prayer for all future believers, which again is prophecy, because there were no future believers when he prayed it, but he knew there would be. But and now we do John 18 this Monday night, which is going to be some of the ugly stuff, the Garden of Gethsemane, the denials of Peter. This is where it gets really, really rough for a couple chapters. So we'll be on 18 Monday night.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. And for those of you guys that do follow Bill in Calvary's mobile app, we did kind of rearrange the app this past week. So all of Bill's teachings can now be found at the North Lauderdale campus. That's normally where Bill hosts his studies prior to the virus. So if you enter into the North Lauderdale campus, you'll see all of his teachings there in Calvary's mobile app. And as always, Bill, any closing thoughts or comments to the group?
No, I just know how much it means that at the end of a day, when you're wanting to put your feet up and take it easy. You're showing up for a class that's really commendable. To me, it shows your heart towards the Lord, and it gets my full respect because we need more people that feel that way. So I love seeing you guys here, and hopefully I'll see you Monday or next Wednesday.